Cleopatra, a long tale for a long night. The desert keeps its secrets by speaking slowly. It sands down sharp stories until they are smooth enough to hold. If you sit still at dusk on the city's edge, where Alexandria's last houses lean toward the sand, you can hear the wind practice old names against the stones. One of those names is Cleopatra. Not the painted dream of 1,000 cheap plays, not the rumor in a Roman senator's mouth, but a woman who learned to use rooms and rivers the way other people use words. This is her story, told without lessons, without glossaries, in the voice of a city that knew her footsteps. Prologue: the balcony where languages sleep before the throne became a battlefield. Before carpets unfurled like stage curtains, there was a balcony and a girl who listened. The palace wore the color of ripe grain, its courtyard smelled of oil lamps and fresh ink. Servants moved with the hush of practiced invisibility. From the balcony, the girl could see ships drawing lines across the harbor as if the sea were a ledger. Her name, long as a procession, was Cleopatra Philopator, daughter of Ptolemy. In the evenings, she counted the city's rhythms, donkey bells, arguments at the fish market, the sudden liquid laughter that spills from taverns when a joke finally lands. She kept those sounds like coins in her pocket. A court scholar once told her that language is a key you wear on the inside. She tested that key on every lock she could find. Greek came first, the home tongue of her dynasty. Then Egyptian, which her ancestors had treated like a robe to be worn in public rituals and folded away in private. Cleopatra wore it the way a river wears its banks, naturally, with pressure in the right places. Later came Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, words like boats, each suited to a different water. If she loved anything more than the taste of new words, it was the reaction on a fisherman's face when the queen's daughter answered him in his own language and did not flinch at the smell of his nets. The palace was a garden grown inside stone. Vines were trained to climb the walls. Peacocks rehearsed their vanity by the ornamental pool. The beauty was not an accident. It was a trap for the eye. Power moved in the shade between pillars, where uncles learned to smile with their eyelids and a cousin could be an ally at breakfast and a knife by supper. Cleopatra learned quickly that safety was not a silk cushion. Safety was a ledger balanced, a promise kept in three directions, a friend who did not talk in rooms with echoes. Her father, Ptolemy XII, loved music more than he loved decisions. Rome was the shadow that fell across his maps. He negotiated with it the way a small bird negotiates with the geometry of a hawk. Sometimes the household fled the city under a moon that looked like a coin held up to the light, the king too eager to keep what he had borrowed, Rome too patient to forget the rate of interest. Cleopatra traveled well. She could fit her life into a trunk and her plans into a sentence. On the deck of a hired ship, she promised to see that when she returned to the palace it would be as a person who chose doors, not one who begged them to open. Part 1, 2 crowns and a chair meant for one when the old king's body cooled. A will was read in a sober, careful voice. It called for a duet, Cleopatra, barely 18, to rule with her younger brother, a boy whose sandals still pinched his heels. The law was an old robe. Many had worn it. The true garment, the one that fit, was power, and the robe hangs badly on two shoulders at once. Advisors taught the boy to speak. They taught the courtiers to listen to him as if the words were his. Cleopatra, who had learned the trick of silence long ago, counted faces instead of sentences and began to feel the floor tilt under her. The first betrayals were soft. A door that should have opened stuck for a heartbeat. A letter that should have arrived came late, and when it came, the wax was broken and resealed with the seal that pretended it had never left its ring. The soft betrayals went crisp. Guards who had never been more than shadows collected in doorways like commas grown bold. A nurse who had never cried in her life tugged Cleopatra down a scribal corridor that smelled of papyrus dust and river reeds. "Go," she said, and for once the girl who had always asked questions did not ask one. She went. Exile is a teacher who doesn't raise her voice. The desert writes on the skin what cities write on paper. The sun edits your pride until only the necessary lines remain. Cleopatra crossed distances that look small on maps and enormous underfoot. With her went 3 women who did not know how to leave her, a secretary who remembered numbers like a second heartbeat, and a captain who could smell a sandstorm before the horizon learned its shape. Money steeped in sweat does not sound like coin anymore. It sounds like time. She spent both carefully. From tents stitched to withstand wind, she sent eyes into Alexandria. Reports returned like birds who had learned a new song. The boy king's advisors were speaking Rome's favorite words, words that dressed ambition as stability. Rome was listening. Rome always listened when grain was involved. Julius Caesar was in the city, and Caesar was a man who believed problems were future victories wearing bad disguises. Cleopatra knew what to do with a man who believed that. She would give him a victory with her face on it. Part 2, the carpet that remembered its duty. Stories that survive for centuries are rarely accurate. They are simply the most portable. The carpet story survives because it fits on a stage and can be mimed by anyone with a blanket and a friend willing to play a suspicious guard. A servant carried a bundle through hallways dense with Roman leather and Egyptian resin. He spoke the sentence he had memorized. The guards weighed the sentence and the hour and let the bundle through. The room on the other side belonged to Caesar for the night. The bundle unfurled like a tongue, and Cleopatra stood up from its red wool with the unhurried grace of someone who knows she has the floor. He was older than she had pictured, the lines of his face cut by weather and habit. He looked like a man who has no patience for people who pretend not to understand him, and like a man who could still be surprised by a new kind of courage. Cleopatra bowed enough to recognize his position and not 1 inch more. Then she spoke. She did not waste adjectives, she spent facts. The city would burn without her. The boy would be a puppet whose strings ended in Rome, and Egypt would become a province in all but name, its river a pipe to feed the bellies of men who had never seen how a flood writes a calendar into mud. Choose, she said, and because he was Caesar and hated the taste of being managed, he smiled. She had made it look like his choice. The siege that followed wrapped the palace like a second wall. Fire behaved like a hungry child. The library bled pages. Caesar's soldiers built barricades from carts and stubbornness. Cleopatra counted the days the granaries could feed, the nights the watch could stay awake, the names of officers who would bend without breaking. She sent a boy who could row in a straight line even in black water. She paid a woman whose dog did not bark at Latin. She slept the way generals sleep, eyes closed, plans awake. Rivers make decisions for cities. The Nile rose obedient to math older than most gods. In the collapsing game of angles and alleys, the boy king's forces broke. In the churn of failure, Ptolemy sank where he could no longer be a problem for the living. Alexandria coughed smoke, coughed ashes, and then drew a new breath that did not taste like panic. Cleopatra walked through courtyards that had survived flame and counted what remained. A throne. A people. A city that could believe again if given a reason. Part 3. The river, the room, the child. There is work that looks like ceremony and work that looks like work. A wise ruler never lets anyone see where one ends and the other begins. Cleopatra appeared in the streets dressed as Isis, not to pretend she had become a goddess, but to remind people that she remembered whom the gods were supposed to protect. She spoke Egyptian from balconies and Greek at councils and never forgot to ask fishermen if the price offered for their catch was insult or respect. Grain moved without vanishing into courtiers' mouths. Priests were consulted without being allowed to tyrannize. Numbers lined up in columns that ended in relief instead of debt. On the river, she and Caesar learned each other's efficiencies. He loved the feeling of a plan that had no air bubbles in it. She loved the moment when a plan exhaled and became a fact. They fit, which is not the same as saying they were kind to one another. Kindness is a luxury in an age of iron. They were allied, sometimes they were tender, often they were tired. Love, when it came as a byproduct of competence, the way smoke follows fire. When her son was born, Egypt exhaled. Names matter. She gave him two the way a door has two hinges, Ptolemy to satisfy the story her house had been telling for generations, and Caesarion to state a truth Rome would not enjoy hearing. Little Caesar, he was a symbol before he had teeth. Cleopatra understood symbols. She understood that one day his name would make a certain kind of man in Rome taste bile. For now, he was a warm weight who slept with miniature fists like questions waiting for their marks. Rome in its pride could host a queen and still insist it was doing her a favor. Cleopatra did not come to kneel. She arrived with the decorum of a storm that has learned manners. In a villa chosen because it was beautiful but not central, she conducted the business of being inevitable. Roman matrons watched her through fans the way cats watch birds. Their husbands measured her with instruments they kept behind their eyes. Caesar's rise gathered speed until it could only end one way. The knives that ended it were old, and so were the reasons that held them. A republic is a system for managing fear, and fear hates a man who refuses to be managed. The news reached Cleopatra with the clean shock of a bell hit by a precise hammer. She did not wait for gossip to grow teeth. She packed grief in the smallest bundle it would fit into, took her child on her hip, and followed the route she had already mapped for just this day. The sea was untroubled. It had seen worse. Part 4, How a City is Held Together by Hands You Don't See. Back in Alexandria, the palace learned a new quiet. It was not the silence of fear, that silence cracks under its own weight, but the silence of concentrated effort. Cleopatra visited granaries the way doting mothers visit cradles. She attacked corruption not with public fury but with private arithmetic. This much goes here, this much goes there. That man no longer has access to anything someone else needs. She paid the priesthood enough to make piety fashionable. She paid the army enough to make loyalty convenient. She paid attention, which is the cheapest currency and the one most rulers fail to spend. The boy grew. In the afternoons, she let him watch the river from a shaded window and told him stories that were not untrue, merely angled. When he asked about Rome, she spoke of buildings like teeth and a city that believes its weather is your problem. When he asked about his father, she said he was a man who built ladders faster than other men knew they were on the ground. She did not mention daggers. There would be time for metal later. Rome arranged itself into a triangle, the better to pretend that power could be shared. Octavian took one side, Mark Antony another, a third man the third, useful, briefly. Triangles are stable until someone leans. Antony leaned east, toward places where the horizon is mostly water and the taxes are paid in grain. East meant Egypt. Egypt meant the woman Roman orators had learned to pronounce as a threat. Summons arrived the way weather arrives, expected, unappealing, impossible to ignore. Cleopatra did not let herself be summoned. She chose a date, a harbor, a wind. She chose purple for the sails because everyone in the world understands the grammar of that color. She chose music because men who think they are immune to beauty have never had to make decisions while a flute is reminding them that breathing can be an art. She dressed as a goddess not because she believed she was one, but because religion is a language that even cynics can read when it is written in gold leaf. Part 5, A city built of two people looking at each other. Tarsus had seen conquerors before. It had not seen that barge. Antony, who had a soldier's appetite for competence, watched Cleopatra dock and enjoyed the rare pleasure of not being bored. He was handsome in the way men are handsome when they are not trying to be. He moved like someone who could break a table with his hands if he forgot to manage himself. He had debts, favors to men he did not like, promises made to cities he would someday disappoint. He had a reputation that entered rooms before he did and sometimes made a mess of the furniture. Their first conversation went like a chess match between people who have refused to play by the book so long they have become their own book. Antony wanted money and grain and the kind of alliance that looks like a handshake and feels like a knot. Cleopatra wanted protection, Rome's heavy hand turned outward instead of inward, and space to build something that might survive her. She gave feasts as if they were treaties that came with fruit. He drank like a man who trusted his liver more than he trusted other men. They laughed. Laughter is a contract too. Alexandria received Antony with the curiosity it reserves for animals that might be dangerous but could also be trained. He adapted faster than anyone expected. He played at being Alexandrian the way a river plays at being calm, surface smooth, current intent. With Cleopatra he found a room in himself he had not used much, the one where listening happens. With him she found a room she had feared was closed to her forever, the one where someone else chooses the wrong word and you do not have to correct it because it does not matter. They had children, and the halls of a palace that had learned the rhythm of policy learned the rhythm of spilled milk. In public, they executed ceremonies so precise they looked like instinct. In private, they were occasionally ridiculous, which is to say, alive. The city, which admires precision but loves the ridiculous, loved them for it. And for a while. Rome does not love anything for long that it cannot tax or name. Octavian built a career out of being underestimated by people who should have known better. He collected rumors, the way misers collect coins, quietly with satisfaction. He taught Rome a story in which Antony was a puppet and Cleopatra the hand. The story was not true, which made it perfect. People defend untruths with a fervor they rarely grant to facts. The donations of Alexandria, those glittering public gestures in which lands were assigned to children too small to keep a tunic clean, gave Octavian exactly what he needed. He pointed at a map and said, "See, they are drawing without our ink." The Senate, understanding the remark, if not the map, found its outrage and wore it like a laurel. Part 6, Actium, which means wind wars begin years before the first trumpet tries to talk sense into the air. They begin when men with sharp quills learn to draw borders so straight that real land must break to match them. They begin when grain prices inch upward like snakes in tall grass. They begin when ships are built by men who know their planks by name and pretend not to know what the ships are for. At Actium, the sea made the rules. Cleopatra's fleet, trained to move like a school of fish, kept formation even when smoke invented new coastlines. Antony's veterans fought like men who remember what it feels like to be outnumbered and win anyway. Octavian's admiral watched the flags and the wind and put his faith in both. At a moment that later generations would pretend was a moment and not the tail end of 100 small decisions, Cleopatra turned east. She had told Antony the plan. She had not. She had implied it. He had understood. He had not. Historians love the shape of moments. They are less fond of the fog that fills them. Antony followed. Love is a word. So is calculation. Whatever word lives best in your mouth, use it. The affect was the same. Position changed hands like a dropped cup. Octavian's men closed the circle. The story wrote itself. A queen ran, a general chased, a future emperor won. Rome applauded its own ability to recognize a moral when handed one. Part 7. The long afternoon Alexandria after Actium was not a fallen city. It was a city that had remembered how to whisper. Cleopatra put on the face that says nothing will be allowed to fall apart today. She meant it. She negotiated with governors who suddenly found their loyalty detachable. She wrote to kings whose signatures used to be worth a shipment of cedar and now were worth a prayer. Antony tried to rebuild the shape of himself that had been broken by a glance backward over water. Sometimes he succeeded. Often he did not. He swung between fury and the kind of sadness that looks like sleep. The last day arrived the way last days do, looking like any other until it wasn't. A report ran faster than truth. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, performed a Roman ending. Blood is always redder in rooms where hope has recently been a guest. They carried him to the place where she had folded herself temporarily into absence. They saw each other again, which is the luxury fate grants lovers when it is being generous. Words said then are for the two who said them. The city stepped back like a servant who knows this is a moment that must not have witnesses and will be witnessed anyway by every curtain in the room. Octavian entered as men enter places they want to own, politely. He wanted Cleopatra alive. Rome liked to see its victories turn their faces toward the crowd. She saw herself as afloat in a triumph and was disgusted enough to be calm. There are only a few doors a trapped person can open alone. She chose one. A basket of figs, a method no one can swear to. Two women, Charmian and IRAs, moving with the alert grace of people whose choices are few and clear. If it was a snake, it was not the point. If it was a salve, it was not the point. The point was sovereignty, scaled down to a last decision, signed not with ink, but with pulse. When Octavian's men pushed into the room that had stopped being a room, they found a queen laid out like a sentence, so balanced no one dared improve it. "Was this well done of your lady?" someone asked the attendant. Charmian adjusted the diadem, which is the sort of business one attends to when the world is ended, and said, "It is well done and very fitting for the descendant of so many kings." She was tired. The line has survived because it is perfect. It may not be true. It does not matter. After, what a city remembers, empires turn lives into coins and spend them. Egypt became Rome the way night becomes morning, inevitably, with a color change others call progress. Caesarion vanished along the road power travels to get rid of rivals. Cleopatra Selene learned to wear her dusk-colored name in another country and did well by it. Octavian called himself Augustus and built a peace so careful it felt like a hand at the back of the neck. The city did not forget. Fishermen told their grandsons about the afternoon the queen stood on the quay and asked how many nets were enough. Priests remembered that she had brought the right animals and the right words, not because the gods hunger for blood and grammar, but because the people do, and a ruler who feeds the people's rituals saves the gods from hunger too. The men who had stood in the market with baskets bitten thin by years told stories about the winter when bread did not spike in price. Those are dull stories until you are hungry. Then they are the only stories that matter. A clerk in the granary, a man no one would have noticed if he had sat down in your house, kept a tablet to the day he died on which he had scratched numbers clean and even. When his daughter married, he gave her a small chest. Inside it were two things, a pin with a chipped blue stone and that tablet. "This," he said, "the pin is pretty." Of the tablet, he said, "This is why we did not starve when I was your age." She kept both and learned to dust the tablet as if it were an icon. Years passed. Rumors thinned. The sea went on pushing and retrieving the same strip of beach the way an old man worries a prayer rope. In taverns, men who had not been born when Cleopatra lived argued loudly about what kind of woman she had been. A fool said she had been only a beauty. A louder fool said she had been only cruel. The owner of the tavern, who had a widow's impatience for stupid generalities, said she paid her bills. That ended the argument for a while. Not everything can be remembered. Some acts disappear exactly because they were done well. Water sent to the right fields ruins no one's boots and leaves no testimony. Letters that persuade never make it to archives, only the angry ones do. Speeches that turned a mob into a city vanish into the habits that followed. We know she did those things because countries do not stay whole for long on charm alone, and if Egypt held together under her, it was because her hands were on more levers than the poets care to list.
The last light, a scene no one saw, told anyway. Picture a morning when the air sits close to the skin, already warm. A woman walks the palace's eastern loggia, the place where the sun finds columns to practice on.
She is alone because she has earned solitude, and because solitude is where thoughts learn to be thoughts. Below her, the city blinks itself awake. Bakers with flour on their hands, fishermen turning ropes into neat sleeping snakes, scribes rubbing the sleep from their fingers. She is rehearsing a speech she will give that day to men who believe they have already chosen how they will vote. She will not shout. She will not weep. She will not lean on the crutch of ancestry. She will talk about grain, about work, about how a city that thinks only with its pride eventually forgets how to eat. Someone calls her name from the shadowed end of the loggia. One of the nursewomen who have survived every change of staff because they have mastered the art of knowing when to be seen and when to vanish. Breakfast, the nurse says. The queen nods and turns. For a single indulgent heartbeat, she lets herself think about honey on bread and watered wine and the way her son's hair will stick to his forehead if he runs in the courtyard before the day learns to behave. Then she tucks the thought into a pocket and goes where she is expected to be. This is power, to want, to set wanting aside, to return to it in the slice of time between problems. I tell you this scene not because it is documented, but because a life is made mostly of such scenes. When we build our statues, we tell the statues stories. The carpet, the barge, the ASP. The days that actually held her were quieter and stronger. She listened more than she spoke. She counted. She edited.
She learned what every woman learns, who is obliged to run a house while men argue about the color of the roof, that the roof can be any color at all as long as the rain remains outdoors. Coda, the harbor where ghosts practice being boats on a still night late in the year. The harbor becomes a mirror.
Sailors say you can see what you miss if you look long enough without blinking. They say a barge with purple in its wake moves silently across that mirror, and on it a woman reclines as if she were made of air and iron in equal parts. She does not wave. Queens don't. But if you watch her hands, you will see her count something only she can see, and when her mouth moves, you will notice she is not praying. She is adding, when the wind comes up, the picture breaks into usual water. Dock lines creak, lanterns stutter and then behave. A boy runs down the quay shouting about fish because dinner is an empire too, and every empire needs messengers. On the western wall of the city, a shadow slips along the stones where sentries once stood and now stand again. Alexandria does what cities do when they remember and forget at the same time. It sleeps, it bargains, it wakes, it eats, it tells stories, it names the sea, and lets the sea keep its own name. If you want to keep something of Cleopatra, do not memorize the costumes. Remember instead the habit behind them, attention as worship, work as spell, mercy measured, iron kept for when it is truly needed. Remember the fisherman whose name she used in the right case, the scribe whose page she read aloud without stumbling, the nurse whose single syllable sent her into exile alive. Remember that sovereignty begins where fear ends, not because danger has vanished, but because you have learned how to move while it watches. This is the length of her shadow over the water, measured not in miles but in methods. This is the long tale for a long night. If it comforts you, let it. If it urges you, obey it. The desert keeps its secrets by speaking slowly. Alexandria keeps its queens by refusing to let them be simple.